right, so I think we'll get started with the seminar. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor John Kitchen from Carnegie Mellon University. Professor Kitchen did his BS in chemistry from NC State. From there he moved to Delaware to pursue a PhD with Professor Jingwen Chen and Mark Barteau. And after that, after receiving one of the Humboldt postdoctoral fellowships, he did some work with Matthias Scheffler on in the Fritz Haber Institute in Berlin. Mm-hmm. And from there he started his faculty position at Carnegie Mellon. And there he has developed both an experimental and theoretical group working at various interfaces of understanding how adsorbates interact with surfaces. And today, Professor Kitchen will talk to us about the in situ spectroscopic studies on metal oxide electrodes during water oxidation. So please join me in welcoming Professor Kitchen to this seminar series.
All right, thank you, Yuri. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for coming in to see what I have to say today. So I am going to talk about some in situ studies of water oxidation on metal oxides. I'd like to start by giving you a little overview of Pittsburgh. If you haven't been there in the last 30 years, it's changed a lot. So we're no longer the dirty steel city. We're quite nice. This is the Point downtown. We have our football stadium and baseball stadiums over here. This is the Cathedral of Learning on the University of Pittsburgh's campus, and this are our Carnegie Mellon. So it's a very nice place to live now. It's not as big a city as Boston, but it has its own perks. I'm going to go ahead and acknowledge a few people that have contributed to the work. In particular, Ethan Demeter did most of the work that I'm going to talk about today. He's available for a postdoc if anybody's looking. And then we have collaborators in Denmark and Stanford, Brookhaven, and the Israel Wax Group. And most of the funding for this has come from the Department of Energy. So let me tell you a little bit about my perspective on oxygen evolution, why we're interested in it, why it's important. And the principal idea here is that oxygen is a really critically enabling technology in the future of energy. We need oxygen for a lot of things. We either get it as a byproduct of water splitting, where we need the hydrogen for enhancing biofuel production or fuel synthesis. We may want to store energy in the form of hydrogen or reactions of hydrogen with something else. We need oxygen for gasification, oxycombustion, other medical applications. In any electrochemical reduction process, you need an oxidation reaction to occur to produce protons. Right now, water is one of the best ones to choose. Anything else you have to synthesize. In all of these examples, oxygen evolution is a key efficiency limiting reaction. I'm going to tell you why that's the case today, and I'm going to show you that we think there are limits on how good oxygen evolution can be, and then I'm going to show you two ways that we're working to develop better oxygen electrocatalysts. So this is an old reaction. It might be the second oldest electrochemical reaction. If the first is the fuel cell, it wasn't long after that somebody realized they could run it in reverse and split water to make hydrogen and oxygen. So this graph is a fairly old idea. This is from 1980, where already people were classifying metal oxides, classifying oxygen evolution electrocatalysts in terms of this volcano plot, where you have some kind of chemical descriptor on the x-axis that describes the reactivity of the metal oxide. And on the y-axis here, you have an overpotential. So the overpotential is the extra energy you have to put into the reaction to drive it at a practical rate. So what you would like is the lowest overpotential, ideally as close to zero as possible, because then you're not putting any more energy than is required. And some metals require a lot of extra energy. So lead oxide is a terrible oxygen evolution catalyst. Iron oxide is not that good. And metals like ruthenium and platinum, iridium, and cobalt are all fairly good oxygen evolution catalysts. You only need a little bit of extra potential, 0.2, 0.3 volts, to drive them at practical rates. So these have been known for a long time now. The best materials are expensive, iridium, ruthenium. You need these materials in an acid because they're stable. And the downside of those is they're quite expensive, right? And they're fairly rare compared to other metals. And so there's still outstanding questions in our mind that we're trying to address here. One is, why do we see this volcano? That is, this here is an enthalpy change for lower to higher oxide transition. It's the energy required to oxidize or reduce the metal oxide. If you like, that's related to the strength of an oxygen bond coming off the surface. So why does the activity go up and then down? Why is there still sort of a 150, 200 millivolt overpotential? Why haven't people found good catalysts that are very active at much lower overpotentials? So we'll talk about that. And can we find cheaper metals than this in alkaline electrolytes. So once you go alkaline, you stabilize a lot of these base metals. And where iron oxide and nickel oxide readily dissolve in acid, they're fairly stable in base. Right? So can we find ways to make these better than these materials, or at least approach them so that they're cost effective? So finally, we'll talk about what kind of ways are there to promote the oxygen evolution reaction. Okay, so I'm going to start out with a computational approach. So this is no bait and switch. We will eventually talk about in situ spectroscopy. But we need a framework to think about the oxygen evolution reaction. We need to think about how do we know if there's a limit? How do we know how to make it better? And so the approach that we've taken is to think about this prototypical mechanism, right? Oxygen evolution is a 4-electron process. It has 4 steps that go from water to oxygen. And these are the kinds of intermediates that you can go through. So we're assuming this, we're postulating this mechanism, and now we're going to work through what are the consequences of having chosen this. So now, what would a perfect electrocatalyst look like? Right? We can start down here at water, and we have to go uphill in energy to get oxygen. Right? It's uphill, 237 kilojoules per mole. And I'm going to postulate that going up in 4 even height steps would be a perfect catalyst if we could do that. Now, why is that? Why would I say that's perfect? If you notice, each one of these steps has an electron-proton pair in it. And that electron-proton pair, the energy of it's going to depend on the applied potential. So here at open circuit, it's uphill. We know water doesn't spontaneously decompose. We have to put energy in. And as we start applying a potential, let's say we apply 1/4 volt, then each step comes down by a proportional amount. If we go even more, right, you can see that as we get to 1.23 volts, at that potential, the reaction is now thermoneutral. And if I go just a little bit more, every step is exothermic and downhill. What that implies is that since every step is exothermic, it would be spontaneous. And since they're all downhill, the barriers are presumably going to be small, and the reaction would proceed rapidly. That is what would be a perfect catalyst in this case. So what do we need to do to figure out, does a perfect catalyst exist? So the first thing we're going to do is think about calculating, using quantum mechanics, the reaction energies for each one of these steps, right? So how high is this? What's the reaction energy of this, 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 and this? And we'll do that on a lot of different metal oxide surfaces. So we'll choose a variety of structures, a variety of compositions, and we'll use a computer to screen through all of them and see if we can identify any material that has properties like I described. And in that sense, we use computers as a proxy for an experiment where we have total control over everything and we know what's going on. The second goal, though, would be, having done this, can we identify any electronic structure or other types of chemical descriptors that would explain trends in the reactivity? And if we can do that, then we may be able to say whether there are limitations. Okay, so before I get to the computational part, I want to promote 2 projects I've been working on. This one over here, if you're interested in the kinds of computation, density functional theory, you might be interested in reading it. It's on modeling materials using density functional theory. It's a course I teach at Carnegie Mellon. And if you're not very good at Python programming, which is what this whole framework is based on, then you might be interested in this particular project here, where you can learn all about using Python to do these kinds of numerical methods. Okay, so let's get back to the computational screening part. We know of lots of metal oxide structures: rutiles, reduced forms of it, perovskites, cobalts, manganese oxides, anatase, rock salt structures. All of these kinds of oxides exist. And since we're working in a computer, we can generate these structures, and then we can populate them with all kinds of different metal sites. So we can look at different metal oxides. Some of them may not even exist, but for understanding whether our descriptors are correct and the physics are correct, we can calculate the energy of each one of those steps on each one of these kinds of surfaces and try to find out, does something exist that would be perfect? Okay, so what does a perfect material look like? So again, the blue line here is what a perfect catalyst would look like. As you apply 1.23 volts, the reaction is perfectly thermoneutral. A real catalyst might be this black line. So you can see this step is too high, this step is too high, these steps are too small. The consequence of that is when you apply 1.23 volts to this catalyst, right, this point still comes down to here, but now you have to go up in energy and come back down to be thermoneutral. That means you have to go from something that is stable to less stable and back down. That's like a reaction barrier that's going to slow down the progress. In fact, if you want all of these steps to be exothermic, you have to apply an additional 1.23 volts so that every step is downhill. Right? This is the origin of the overpotential that's required on a particular metal oxide. You have to apply enough overpotential so that all steps are downhill to make the reaction proceed at a practical rate. So you might hope, well, I showed you lots of materials. Maybe we can find one that fixes this step and find one that fixes this step. But it turns out that those steps are not independent of each other. So if we plot step 1 versus step 2, you find out there's a reasonably good correlation in the energies between them. And now if I take step 2 versus step 3, you find an even better correlation. That means there's only one independent step in the whole mechanism that controls the overall reactivity. As soon as you fix one of these steps by picking a material, that determines this step. This step comes over here and determines that step. So we only have 1 degree of freedom, right? The binding energy of oxygen in this case corresponds, each one of these is one of those oxides that I showed you. And as soon as you pick an oxide, you determine all the other steps. So that means we can describe, rather than all 4 steps, we can just define 1 step, and everything else is proportional to it. And so either one of these or a difference between this and this becomes a chemical descriptor for the reactivity of that metal oxide. So we can go through then, as if you think about this x-axis as a descriptor for the material, you could have something that has a very weak binding energy of oxygen up here, a very strong binding energy of oxygen over here. There's a weak potential dependence over here. We can look at the relative activity of each one of these steps. Whichever one is the lowest is what's rate determining for that particular reaction. And you can see across the whole range of materials here, it's either reaction 3 that's rate limiting or reaction 2 that's rate limiting. So as you start from a material over here that binds very strongly, and you go this way, you go up in activity and then back down. Right? Let's look at it a little bit more clearly. Over here you can see, again, we plot it now as the difference here, but reaction 3 is rate limiting for this class of materials, and reaction 2 is rate limiting for this class of materials. Now, that already is the origin of the volcano, that you have one rate limiting step on one side and another rate limiting step on the other side. So that is one reason why we have the volcano relation in the oxygen evolution reaction, is that we have a transition in rate determining step. Now another particularly interesting feature here is, as you go up this line here, there's a crossover point that makes you go back down in activity. And if you look at where the crossover point here is, it's at half a volt, 400 millivolts. It's actually quite far from the thermodynamic minimum. It suggests that with a single site oxide electrocatalyst, you cannot get arbitrarily close to a 0 millivolt overpotential. It implies there's a kinetic limitation on the overall activity of an oxygen evolution catalyst because those steps are correlated with each other. If they weren't correlated, we wouldn't have this problem. You could independently move off of them. But the correlations lead to this kind of a volcano. So where would that perfect material lie? Here again, I show the correlation between step 2 and step 3. This star indicates where you'd have to be on that 0 millivolt overpotential. And you can see it sort of sits out way off the correlation. There are no materials in what we screened that fall over here. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a material. It just certainly means we didn't find one in the fairly comprehensive screening that we did. Even more, because of the correlations that we showed, it suggests there's not a material that is catalyzing all the reaction steps by a single site, which is what happens on most metal oxides. So now what could we do then to think about promoting existing materials? So if we postulate that there is a fundamental wall that you can't exceed, then we should probably choose to focus our efforts somewhere else than trying to beat it. So we can take existing materials and ask, could we mix metal oxides to make them better? Could we make nickel somehow as good as cobalt, or cobalt somehow as good as ruthenium by mixing it with another species? All right, so I'm going to switch now to thinking about the experimental work in my group and trying to understand some of these promotion mechanisms. So it's actually been known for quite a long time. If you take nickel oxide and you add some iron to it, this iron can actually just be an impurity in the electrolyte, and if you cycle it, it gets incorporated into the nickel electrode, that you get a very large enhancement of the oxygen evolution activity. So there are two different ways of looking at it. I like this way the best. As you sweep here, this is a nickel 2+ to 3+ oxidation, and then over here you get the nickel oxidation or oxygen evolution current coming up. If you add a little bit of iron to it, you can see at this potential you get much higher activity. That means you're getting a lot more oxygen coming off this 10% doped iron sample. Now, iron is not very soluble in nickel oxide. It's percent or so. And so there's an outstanding question of how it can be a promoter. And this has been some work that's ongoing in my group, so I'll give you our current thoughts on how iron is acting as a promoter, and then in the final part, make a different suggestion as well. So to make some progress in understanding how does iron promote the nickel oxide material, we synthesized a lot of different electrocatalysts. We tried making very high surface area electrocatalysts where we took a hard template like SBA15, infiltrate it with iron and nickel nitrate salts, calcine it, and then remove the silica catalyst by dissolving it. And that gave us electrocatalysts, in the 100 meters squared per gram range. We make that into an ink, put it onto electrodes, and we can characterize the reactivity. We also looked at some evaporation-induced self-assembly that gave us maybe 30 meters squared per gram. And finally, we looked at a metal mesh. So this is looking at the intersection of a metal mesh, which we had dipped in the nitrate salts and then calcined in air. And it has this sort of tree bark look to it. So this mesh looks a lot like what is in your Windows screen, but it's made out of nickel instead of stainless steel. So we have a pretty broad range of materials, all compositions from pure nickel oxide to pure iron oxide and everything in between. Right, and this is what the results look like. So you start over here at pure nickel oxide. You get pretty reasonable milliamp per milligram loading of catalyst. As you go through about 10%, you see a huge increase in activity, and then as you add more iron, it comes back down. Now, interestingly, this nickel mesh, if you notice over here, is times 0.1. So that nickel mesh was 10 times more active than all of these high surface area materials. And we think that's because you have the metal oxide directly on the current collector that's made out of nickel. So you have extremely good electrical contact between the oxide and the catalyst. But the position of this maximum is about the same for all of them. At least we don't think there are very important differences in here. So the result is essentially independent. Somewhere between 10 and 15% iron, you get a maximum inactivity in the electrocatalyst. Okay, so if we look now, try to characterize what are all of these materials that we're looking at. We start out with our nickel reference, and you see very strong nickel oxide peaks in almost every catalyst as you increase the amount of iron. Here you don't see any real change. There's no shift in the peak positions, right? That's shown over here that the peak position or the lattice constant you calculate for nickel oxide doesn't change. It's independent of the amount of iron. That suggests that we are not incorporating iron into the nickel oxide lattice at all. And what you start to see is, as you get to about 25% iron, is you see formation of this nickel iron 2 spinel phase. So this phase starts to appear already in the 10%, and it grows. And then once you get to 50%, you start seeing very clear indications of Fe2O3. And we know Fe2O3 is a terrible electrocatalyst. So it's conceivable that we have the spinel phase that's forming, and that is a possible way to promote the nickel oxide samples. We see evidence of the spinel phase in the Raman spectroscopy. So these are ex situ dry powders that we put in the Raman. We can see the iron spinel phase. We're currently working on these in situ measurements. I'll talk about those right at the end. Okay, and finally, if we look in Zanes, we looked at this little pre-edge feature right here is indicative of tetrahedrally coordinated iron, and that is exactly what would be in the spinel phase. So we're reasonably sure we have the spinel phase in all of the samples that show very high activity. And when you start getting the Fe2O3, you get substantially lower activity in the electrocatalyst. Now, if we go and look at XApps, we can do this actually under electrochemical control. So we can take a sample in air, then we can put electrolyte in an open circuit, and then we can apply an oxygen evolution overpotential, and we can look for changes in the activity of the surface. And we don't really see anything in the nickel edge. We see no change in the nickel oxygen edge, almost no change in the nickel-nickel XApps shell. But over here in the iron shell, we see a lot of very different changes. So these peaks right here and these peaks right here change in their relative amounts. And these are the peaks associated with octahedral and tetrahedral octahedral coupling. And so what we're seeing is that the speciation of iron is changing under the reaction conditions. We're getting changes in the population of tetrahedral and octahedral sites that exist in the iron nickel spinel. And the surface is clearly changing under the reaction conditions. Now this doesn't tell us a whole lot, and so we had this result. We know now that iron is involved in the oxidation of water, that it's changing the surface. This is clear evidence the catalyst is changing under the oxygen evolution conditions. And so now we're going to start thinking about the actual active phase of the surface. Maybe it's not nickel oxide at all. Maybe it's not even the nickel iron spinel. Right? We can't really tell from what I've shown you so far. And so if we could identify this actual active phase, then we might think about how do we promote the formation of it. And so that's what I want to finish the last part of the talk with. So we started thinking about this, and we were inspired by a paper that talked about electrolyte cations affecting electrochemical reactivity. So this paper, this was in Nature Chemistry. This group showed that if you looked at methanol oxidation, hydrogen oxidation, and oxygen reduction, these all occur on metallic surfaces, right? But they ran it in different electrolytes, cesium, potassium, sodium, lithium hydroxide, and they saw very big changes in the electrochemical reactivity. Right? Lithium showed the worst activity, cesium showed the highest activity in almost every case. So it's exactly the same reaction, exactly the same metal surface. All they're doing is changing the electrolyte. And they're changing it in a way that they're not just messing with the pH or doing anything that would be obvious, but they're seeing this is the log of current, right? So order of magnitude change in the current just by changing the electrolyte. And so we were really interested in this. We thought there might be a similar effect that we could observe in the oxygen evolution reaction, and that cations would affect the surface structure. Now this is certainly not the only example where the electrolyte plays a crucial role. Here at MIT there's some work on nickel and cobalt phosphates and borates that have electrocatalyst materials that form under the reaction conditions and depend on the electrolyte. Those are all anions. Here we have an interesting effect that could be due to the cations. Okay, so if we ran the experiment. So here we're looking at steady state currents. This is a little bit different than a cyclic voltammogram. Here we set a potential, measure the steady state current, increase the potential, measure the steady state current, and we do that to get rid of all the capacitive charging and all of the charging associated with oxidizing the surface. So these are actually all oxygen evolution currents. And you can see here the lithium is, again, the least active, and cesium is the most active. And over here, there's something like a factor of 2 difference in activity. So just by changing from 0.1 molar lithium hydroxide to 0.1 molar cesium hydroxide, we can double the activity of a straight nickel oxide electrocatalyst. All right, and I should point out, these are all reversible. If I take this one and put it in lithium hydroxide, it becomes very bad. If I then switch it back to cesium, it becomes much better. So we can do all of these things reversibly, which makes it very clear it is an electrolyte effect. Okay, so hypothesis 1 confirmed. We can actually promote the oxygen evolution reaction by changing the electrolyte composition. Now we have to think about what's going on at the electrode surface. So what could be causing this promotion? So we've been developing some Raman spectroscopy techniques in my lab. Alex Bell's group and others have used it on nickel oxide, where you can see at low potentials here where no oxygen evolution occurs. It's fairly featureless. As you increase the potential, you get oxidation from nickel 2 to nickel 3, and you get the formation of this new phase that is active under the evolution conditions. So people have studied nickel oxide for a long time for battery applications. These two phases down here are not conductive, so they're not seen very much in electrochemistry. But these form this nickel oxyhydroxide phase. There's a beta phase and there's a gamma phase. And the gamma phase is believed to be the best phase for oxygen evolution because you have the highest oxidation state of nickel in here. It's also a little bit more open. And so we were interested in wondering, could these electrolytes be affecting the speciation of the nickel oxide hydroxy phases that are forming in here? Okay, so our experimental setup looks something like this. We have a green laser that comes out of a microscope. It hits a mirror and goes sideways into an electrochemical cell. We have a gold disc over here. We can deposit nickel oxide onto this gold disc, and then we can do in situ Raman under electrochemical conditions. We have a green laser, so there's no SIRS effect on gold. So we co-deposit silver in here, and you'll see some evidence of silver oxide peaks forming, but that allows us to see the formation of these nickel oxyhydroxide forms. Okay, so this is what it kind of looks like. We use a nickel nitrate bath. We can electrodeposit the nickel onto the gold disc. When we do that, the black line here is our gold disc. When we put nickel oxide on top, we get the red disc. It completely masks the gold. We see no evidence of the gold. We see very crisp, clear nickel 2+, 3+ peaks. And we can make this film extremely thin. We don't know exactly how thin, but it's pretty thin. Okay, if we add a little bit of silver, it doesn't have any effect on the electrochemistry, so we co-deposit silver in there so that we get the SIRS effect. And these are what the cyclic voltammograms look like. Here again, you can see the red peak is the weakest. That's the lithium hydroxide. And the greenish peak is cesium. It's the most active. And then these peaks right here are associated with nickel 2+, 3+ oxidation waves. And then the space in here is related to capacitive charging. So this was missing in the previous plot that looked like a smooth rise up because the previous plot was steady state, and this is cyclic voltammetry. Okay, so what we want to do now, this is just another way of seeing that these peaks, that lithium hydroxide is least active, cesium is most active, and we're interested in knowing what is the surface structure at each of these different places. So what we're going to do, and what I'm going to show you next, is we take Raman spectra at each one of these potentials, and we'll be able to see how the surface structure evolves and how it's different in the different materials. So we're going to start at the lithium end. So if we start here, let me walk you through what you're seeing. Down here, we start at a very low overpotential where no oxygen evolution occurs. As we increase the potential, you start to see the formation of two peaks at these dashed lines. Right? Those peaks correspond to the nickel oxyhydroxide phase. And this is where you start to see oxygen evolution occur. Right? So what I want you to remember in this figure are two things. One is that you hardly see any nickel or silver oxide peak at all. Right? There's no evidence of silver in the electrochemistry, so silver is not electrochemically active here. And you have to go to very high extra potential to see it here. And the other is, at what potential does the formation of this phase start? So here it's about 425 millivolts on the scale that we're looking at here. Right? If I go now to sodium, it qualitatively looks fairly similar. At low overpotentials where no oxygen evolution occurs, we see no formation of the phase, and you have to go fairly high, somewhere between here and here, before you see the onset of this phase forming. Right? And also very little silver oxide. So sodium hydroxide was second most active. No, second, it was above lithium. Lithium, then sodium. Right? Now if we go to potassium, it already looks qualitatively different. You can see that these peaks form much larger. You see a very large silver oxide peak. And you start to see, let's go back one, if this peak is mostly to the right of this dashed line, as we go forward, you see it becomes a little more symmetric. That is, there are more things to the left over here. And the potential where it turns on is probably between 400 and 425. And finally, in cesium hydroxide, you see a very, very large silver oxide peak and a very early onset of this phase forming. right? So we see a further redshift, right, shifting to the left of these in these peaks here. So now, how do we make sense of all of this information? So I'm going to focus now just on the most active and the least active. So here's the most active, cesium hydroxide, least active, lithium hydroxide. It's clear that these phases are forming at a much lower potential in cesium hydroxide than they are in lithium hydroxide. So if the oxyhydroxide phase is the active phase, then it's no surprise cesium hydroxide is more active because you form the active phase at a much lower potential. So that's one piece, is that you see already the formation of this at a lower potential than you do in cesium. But the other more subtle point is if you look at the distribution of points around the dashed lines. So over here you have the majority of points on this side. So these are stiffer bonds that's associated with shorter nickel-oxygen bond lengths. That is much more like the beta phase of nickel oxyhydroxide. Over here you have more on the left side that's associated with longer bonds that are softer, right? So this is more like the gamma phase. So it's very difficult to distinguish beta from gamma. They're both nickel oxyhydroxide phase. The beta form is considered to be more close packed, and the average valency is about 3, while the gamma phase is considered to be more disordered and more open with an average valency of about 3.7. And so this higher oxidation state here favors water oxidation. And so if you could promote the formation of gamma phase, you would be promoting this particular electrocatalyst. And so our current thought right now is that the gamma phase may be favored in cesium hydroxide because the ions are bigger. There is intercalation of ions into the nickel oxyhydroxide phase, and that may favor the formation of gamma, and that's supported by the higher intensity of peaks over here. It's also supported by the very strong, intense silver oxide peak that we see. Right? The only way we can see silver oxide is if silver particles become in contact with the electrolyte. The only way they can become in contact with the electrolyte is if the oxide phase opens up and water penetrates deep into the film. Right? That doesn't happen with lithium hydroxide, and we think it does happen with cesium hydroxide. So that's our current thoughts. We see some promotion effects up to a factor of 2 just by looking at different materials. We're currently going back to the nickel-iron system to try to assess whether that spinel phase may favor the formation of that gamma phase that we talked about. In any case, for nickel oxide, this electrolyte is a fairly non-trivial role in promoting oxygen evolution, and the surface is clearly changing under reaction conditions. So even though we make a very well-defined nickel oxide catalyst in the lab, when we put it into the electrochemical environment, it changes fairly radically. And that active phase may be promoted by the electrolyte. So this is certainly the case for nickel oxide. We have not looked at other oxides to find out how general that idea is. All right, so I'm going to wrap up and conclude. So electrolyte effects are significant, right? You can double an apparent reaction rate, or in some cases, get an order of magnitude change in reaction rate just by changing the electrolyte. The electrocatalyst surfaces, they change under oxygen evolution conditions. This change is reversible as you go up and down. These peaks form and disappear. The oxide-promoted nickel oxide electrocatalyst we think is due to the formation of spinel phases, but now that I've shown you the oxide surface changes so much under reaction conditions, we actually are going back to figure out whether it's spinel or that the iron is somehow promoting the formation of the gamma phase. Right? And the origin of the volcano is because there are these correlations between intermediates on the surface, and they lead to an intrinsic limit on electrocatalyst activity. So with that, I'd be happy to answer questions, discuss, dodge tomatoes.
Right, we have time for some questions. Yes.
So the electrolyte you mentioned in this talk is the hydroxide species of the cation.
Right.
Have you looked at the effect of just the cations with associating like a non-coordinating anion, such as tetrafluoroborate, hexafluorophosphate?
Yeah, so we need the high pH to stabilize nickel oxide.
Right.
So if you did it at neutral conditions, it would just corrode.
No, I mean you would add sodium hydroxide at the same time with the other two.
Yeah, I see. No, we haven't tried that.
How do you know like the effect is not due to iron pairing in the solution?
We have looked pretty extensively. So all these hydroxides are contaminated by iron at the part per million or part per billion level.
Oh, sorry. My question was, how do you know the effect of the electrolyte is not due to ion pairing?
Oh, ion pairing. Sorry. I don't know that at all.
So for the iron, so at this point you still don't know then if when you add the iron it's just because it's promoting then, as you said, that active species of nickel, or it's actually some kind of bimetallic effect.
Yeah, we're unclear on whether it could be a bimetallic effect as in a sort of mixed nickel iron site, or if it can promote the formation of a particular phase, or if the iron is incorporated into that active phase. We just know it makes it better.
Yeah.
For cheap. If I was in Delaware, we would just use tap water and there would be so much iron.
Yes.
Have you looked at all at neutral conditions with these Lucera catalysts?
Yeah,
And
so
especially with Raman, do you see this nickel oxyhydroxide?
yeah, we haven't looked at that, but that is on a short list of things to do.
Because I think that's, based on XApps, that's what the little molecules, or whatever you want to call them, clusters, they're supposed to be these pieces of nickel oxyhydroxide.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're sort of generally interested in how the electrolyte modifies the electrode surface to become what is actually active. But that's a good idea and on a short list.
Yes.
And on your computer simulations, you mentioned that none of the materials that you examined were optimum. They were off that scattergram that you showed. Were any of the materials that you looked at potentially worth testing in the lab and maybe theoretically better than the standard plain nickel?
Yeah, so unfortunately all the standard candidates come up here, iridium oxide, ruthenium oxide.
Okay, so
They're already at the top, so we sort of confirmed that those should be the best ones. So that part of the model works, and so where we've tried to refocus our energy is, taking nickel oxide and cobalt oxide are for details that are important but not real interesting, in the wrong place on this diagram because of errors in the DFT calculations. But we're trying to take cheaper materials and find ways to promote them to be, if we can make nickel almost as good as cobalt by adding iron, which is pretty remarkable. Right? I don't know that we can add a little iron to cobalt and make it almost as good as ruthenium, but we'll see.
So these promotional effects with the cations and the anions, I know that you mentioned, but did you try it just generally with, let's say, ruthenium oxide, iridium oxide, some of the standard stuff that's out there?
Yeah, that's our summer plan is to look at iridium oxide because if it turns out it's directly tied to the formation of the oxyhydroxide phase, that may be specific to nickel, which would be interesting in itself, but not as exciting.
So I have two questions. So first question is using cation because I think you said that you think it could break you away from the volcano limitation. Is there evidence supporting that?
No, I didn't say that it could break it out of the volcano. It could move it up and down the leg.
Oh, I see. So the whole point going to exercise cation is to.
Yeah, the whole point would be, say, take something here and just move it up a little bit. So the cation effect in our hands is only like a factor of 2, right? And what you want is maybe a factor of 10.
But you can supply like the difference on order of 10.
Yeah. by a totally different mechanism.
And the second question I have is for the Raman stuff, is it possible to detect those intermediates that you predict in your DFT in Raman?
Yeah, so Alex Bill's group has seen evidence of some of the peroxyl, the OOH species. I don't think at the surface, but they have a very specialized setup with the optics in the electrolyte. So they have a much higher resolution in signal to noise than we have. We haven't seen anything that would. So the Raman really detects the whole film in this case, and I don't think we could pull out a surface-specific peak. That's the short answer.
I had a question about the Raman spectroscopy. I wonder if you could speculate about what the lower frequency feature for the near 480 wave numbers is.
This one?
Yes.
That's silver oxide.
No, the one that's right in the middle. I'm wondering about this because the higher frequency feature near 560 or 580 corresponds to an oxygen in a threefold hollow site on nickel 111. And on similar experiments where oxygen is exposed to nickel 111, there's also a low frequency feature, but it hasn't been structurally identified what that is. So I was curious if you had some speculation what it might be. Some people seem to think it's like a bulk-like oxygen species. So do your experiments say anything towards this?
I don't have a good answer for that. So far, we've been treating these two dashed lines are the signature of the nickel oxyhydroxide phase, but we haven't thought much more about what they are at the atomic scale.
So generally speaking, do both features show up in tandem?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so they never show up separately.
They always show up together, and the ratio of intensities sort of determines the beta gamma ratio.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Since I want to ask about this technique, since you can detect the formation of other nickel phase, I'm just curious, can you detect the valence change of the nickel, like as a result of, for example, oxygen non-stoichiometry, that such kind of thing?
So the answer is not directly. What you can interpret, right, in a spectrum like this is, and this is only interpretation. So if your bonds are shorter, right, then they have a higher frequency shift over here. If they're shorter, they tend to be less oxidized. If they're longer, right, that's on the left side here, then you tend to have higher valency. But you can't like sort of back out even an average valence number or anything like that. You can only interpret it like I just said. So I think you need a synchrotron method to extract out something that you would call a quantitative oxidation state from Zanes or something like that. Even that is interpretation from reference. Something that you say, we define this compound to have this oxidation state and its edge comes here. Here's a compound that has this state, it's here. My signal is somewhere in between, and you interpolate.
All right. There's no more questions. Please join me in thanking John.
All right. Thanks.